Hello and welcome to our 7-8 minutes of weekly Torah talk. Our guest today is Rabbi Hyim Shafner of the Beit Abraham congregation in St. Louis. Hello, Rabbi. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
I'm not far from you in Little Rock, Arkansas, but we are going to discuss the weekly parsha as usual, and this week it's Lech Lecha. It's an eventful parsha. God commands Abraham to go from your land to the land which I will show you. Abram and his wife Sarai journey to the land of Canaan. Then a famine forces them to depart for Egypt, where the beautiful wife is taken to Pharaoh's palace. A plague convinced the Pharaoh to return her to Abram. Back in Canaan, Abram's nephew Lot falls captive to 4 kings that conquer the 5 cities of the Sodom Valley where he resides. Abram sets out to rescue his nephew and defeats the 4 kings. God seals the covenant between the parts with Abraham, in which the exile and the persecution of the people of Israel is foretold. Still childless 10 years after their arrival in the land, Sarah tells Abraham to marry her maidservant Hagar. Hagar conceives, Ishmael is born. God changes Abram's name to Avraham and Sarai's to Sarah. Abraham is commanded to circumcise himself. What a parsha. The first pasuk says, ויאמר אדוני לאברהם, לך לך מארצך וממולדתך ומבית אביך אל הארץ אשר אראך. And the Lord said to Abraham, go forth from your land and from your birthplace and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. So, Rabbi, at the end of the previous parsha, Parashat Noach, we read the following pasuk, and these are the generations of Terach. Terach begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran begot Lot. Why him? We've never heard of him except for this pasuk. This looks almost like an arbitrary choice.
Right, that's a great. I mean, why Abraham?
Yeah, of course.
Right, that's a great question. I'm intrigued by that, and I'm also intrigued by why the Torah's introduction to the first Jew is Lech Lecha me'artzecha. Why isn't it stay where you are, build a community? Why isn't it something like Shema, Shabbat, the 10 Commandments? Why is the first commandment to the first Jew leave? And as you said, why is it Abraham? And my sense is that it's setting the tone for something. The Torah chooses this carefully. It wants us to know that this is a dramatic moment, and it's a moment of journey. It's a moment of transition. Perhaps leave, and Abraham doesn't know where he's going. He doesn't know that he's going to go to Canaan. El Arz Asher Arecha. So there's certainly a sense of faith, but there's also a sense of Abraham becoming uprooted, of Abraham traveling in the world. In fact, the commentaries tell us that God wanted Abraham to travel because Abraham has a message. And in those days, there was no internet, there's no TV. You had to travel around if you want to get your message out. But taking a journey, taking a risk, being different than everybody else, being the other. Abraham's going to travel, he's not going to fit in. That's the beginning of the Jewish people. Why Abraham? That's a good question. Why not? I remember when my children were young, and they learned Parashat Noach, and I said, "What did you learn about Noach?" And they said, "Noach's a tzaddik. He's so righteous." I said to them, "Noach wasn't Jewish." So, what do you mean Noach's not Jewish? So that's the question. Why Abraham?
Yeah, well, with Noach, at least we get some explanation. He's tzaddik bedorotav in his generation. We don't know anything about Abraham.
Right. And in fact, I think that Chazal, I think the rabbis were bothered by that. And that moved them to create a lot of medrash to really fill in the gaps, to fill in the lines. And
the stories about his childhood, about his debates with his brother and with his father.
And what's interesting about it is there is a real diversity of medrash in imagining what Abraham was like. What brought Abraham, in a certain way, the Midrash, I think, is telling us it's not God that chose Abraham. It is Avraham. There's something special about him. Not that God chose him. We're not Calvinists. There's something about Avraham that makes him the right person. And that's, I think, what moves all of those Midrashim. For instance, And there's a real diversity of thought about what is it that makes Abraham unique. The famous Midrash that many know, that he was 3 years old and his father had an idol store, and he broke the idols, and he put the hammer in the hand of the largest idol, and somebody came in to buy an idol, and they said, "What happened here?" And his father came in and said, "Well, what happened? What did you do, Avram?" And he said, "The biggest idol killed all the other idols." And he said, "Well, that can't be." And so, of course, Avram said, "Well, if that's true, why do we worship him?" So that's one version of who Avram was, that at 3 years old, he realized that idols didn't have any power. But there are other versions of that Midrash also. For instance, Maimonides, the Rambam, says that Avram was somebody who, from a very young age, began to think. And he doesn't tell that story of the idols. He says Avram was like a scientist. He looked closely at the world, and he said,
So for the Rambam, the right man for the job is the scientist and the thinker, because that's the ideal person in the Rambamist thought.
Sure. And it's not that, and for the Rambam, it takes Avram a long time, 40 years, to find God. It's a quest. And it comes not because he's religious or he's moved to find the Spirit. It comes out of being in the world. It says the sun rises and the sun sets. The sun must not be a God. The stars move and they come up and they go down. They must not be the God. That Avram, for the Rambam, has a sense that there must be something that moves. There must be a prime mover. And in the Rambam's words, Avram, his mind starts to wander and he starts to think. And it's not until he's 40 years old that he comes upon the notion of a monotheistic God, of one God.
So we assume that when we first meet Avram, when God tells him Lech Lecha, this is already in the middle of his life. Something happened before that, and the Torah doesn't even bother telling us what is it that happened before the first commandment.
Yeah, that's a good question.
What is it? Why is it hiding from us, Avram's past?
Right. That's a terrific question. And it's funny, actually. The very strange thing is, at the end of Parashat Noach, Avram's father Terach is already on his way to Canaan with Avram. So, in a certain sense, Avram doesn't come out of nowhere. Even though Terach was not a Jew, he was an idol worshiper, he wasn't a monotheist. It's interesting. There's something about the land that Terach is seeking.
He did not complete his journey. He stopped in the middle of the road, and Avram was commanded to complete the journey. So
Avram comes out of something, comes out of a tradition. But you're right, we don't meet Abraham until he's 75 years old. And I think that's part of the lesson. And in Judaism, God doesn't just come to somebody and say, "Here I am," like he does to Moses. He does to Moses, but Moses is born a Jew. Avram has to find God. We have to do the work of finding God. God doesn't just present himself to a prophet and then create a religion. The Jewish people we have to seek God. And indeed, we live in a world where the Kabbalists tell us God is hidden. And that's the Jewish people at their best is not standing at Mount Sinai. That's not the moment we remember. It's coming out of Egypt when we have to cry out to God before God can become present to us.
And you said that Avraham is traveling to carry a message with him. Is it true also, both for the traveling into the land and then to the continued traveling into Egypt, for example, because he has to go to Egypt because of the famine? Maybe he's still carrying a message with him.
Right, sure. Yeah, even though God tells Avram, I'm going to take you to the land, and the original thought about Judaism, it's very clear from our Parsha, is it'll be a nation in a land that will be a blessing to all the other peoples by the way it acts. And that's how you get a message across in the world. You become a nation in a land. But ultimately, the Jewish people end up wandering in exile. And that becomes the way the Jewish people spread the message of monotheism. But it doesn't seem to be that that's the original plan. The original plan is for the Jews to be a model nation in a land, and through that to be a blessing. But most of our history hasn't been lived that way.
Yeah, that is true.
It's interesting. You also find another midrash, which is fascinating. This one really speaks to me. It's Avram as the French existentialist. That the midrash says that Avram sees the world, and he sees it as if it's a palace on fire. And he says, if the palace is burning, there must be an owner of the palace. And at that moment, when he questions that, God sort of opens the window and says, Ani Bal Habira, I am the master of the castle. And it's almost reminiscent of Kafka. But it's through the world being a place of injustice, through the world being a bizarre place, a place that's on fire. It doesn't make sense. That's how Avram says there must be something bigger. There must be a rhyme and reason.
That's a beautiful story. We'll conclude with that. Thank you, Rabbi, and Shabbat Shalom.